Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into the world of one of the most intricate, disciplined, and awe-inspiring civilizations in human history, Imperial China. For over 2 millennia, this empire shaped the world with its innovations in science, philosophy, warfare, governance, and art. But don't let the grandeur fool you. As dazzling as the Forbidden City may appear from a distance, life inside its walls, or anywhere in the empire really, was far from a fairy tale. Before we begin, if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling is your thing, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy it. No pressure. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing who's joining us from across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that cozy hum in the background, and let's drift back together into a different time. Welcome to Imperial China, where the moment you're born, society gently hands you a roll and then bolts the door. Imagine society as a towering, multi-layered cake, but you're somewhere near the base, stale, overbaked, and not even close to the frosting at the top. At the very peak is the Emperor, known as the Son of Heaven, a beautiful title, until you realize heaven doesn't really do feedback forms. He rules through the mandate of heaven, which basically means, as long as harvests are good and people aren't rebelling, heaven's on his side. But when disaster strikes, well, heaven changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Next in line, scholar officials. These were the men who spent most of their existence memorizing Confucian texts, quoting wise sayings no one asked for, and slowly developing hunched backs from endless study over bamboo scrolls. They earned their power through the imperial exams. Think of it like the SATs, if failing meant living in obscurity and poverty for the rest of your life. Then came the farmers, muddy, sunburned, and usually hungry. Yet Confucian philosophy actually praised them. After all, they kept the empire fed. Respect, however, didn't come with a lunch break or a dental plan. Artisans came next, creators of everything from paper to pottery, fans to frustration. They were essential, no doubt, but respected? Not exactly. And then, there were the merchants, often wealthier than anyone else, but about as trusted as a fox in a henhouse. Confucian thought didn't like the idea of profiting off others' labor, so even if you were draped in silk and glittering with silver, you'd still be treated like a shady tax dodger in a fancy robe. Now, we descend to society's basement. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, criminals, anyone you wouldn't want seated next to you at a royal banquet. Monks were somewhere in between. Sacred? Maybe. Confusing? Absolutely. Bald, barefoot, and not easily classified. And finally, women, not even on the pyramid. More like the gravel around it. Raised to obey their fathers, passed on to obey their husbands, and expected to raise sons who would grow up to obey more men. Dreams, ambitions. Society had one answer. That's cute. Now get back to work. Your day in Imperial China didn't start because you were feeling refreshed. It started because a rooster was losing its mind, and the village bell was ringing like it had a personal grudge against your eardrums. You stretch, you yawn, and then it hits you. You can't just exist. First things first, you bow. Not to a god, not to a flag, to your father. Then your mother, then grandpa. Maybe even a great-aunt if she's still breathing and somewhere in range. This isn't just a morning routine. It's filial piety, the sacred duty of respecting your elders. Forget to bow? That's not just rude. That's summoning ancestral shame on your entire bloodline. And no, it's not a one-time thing. You bow when you wake up. You bow before you eat. You bow if someone older coughs vaguely in your direction. If you're not bowing at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now imagine, over your morning tea, you make the mistake of speaking out of turn. You ask something harmless like, "Why exactly do I have to wash Uncle's feet?" Well, congratulations, you just committed an unfilial act. One small step above lighting the neighbor's barn on fire in terms of family shame. Better start rehearsing your apology now. It'll need at least 3 solemn kowtows. And maybe a dramatic forehead-to-floor touch if you really want forgiveness. And yes, even the furniture is silently judging you. Chairs? Only if your family is wealthy. Otherwise, you're kneeling on a mat woven from reeds and quiet resentment, trying not to faint as your elders begin a 45-minute sermon about respect, discipline, and how everything was better before the last dynasty collapsed. Let's not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint that decides who gets to speak, sit, or blink first. Age outranks youth. Men outrank women. Fathers outrank everyone. Even your older siblings can override your existence. If you're the youngest, your best bet is to smile politely and hope you're not blamed for something you didn't do. There's no such thing as a good morning in Imperial China. There's only a series of bowing rituals, internal stress, and a quiet hope that today, maybe, you won't offend someone and get disowned. What's on the table? A steaming bowl of congee, which is a poetic way of saying hot, wet disappointment. It's basically rice boiled in water until it surrenders all texture and identity. If fortune smiles, there might be a dash of salt. If the stars align, you might even find a sliver of pickled vegetable floating by, like spotting a rare bird. If your family is poor, and let's be honest, you probably are, that sad bowl of rice porridge reflects your social status perfectly. Plain, watery, and going nowhere. You eat quietly, respectfully, while being silently evaluated by at least one grandparent who remembers the good old days, when even watery congee was a luxury. Meat? That's reserved for weddings, holy festivals, or bureaucrats who haven't set foot in a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs? Possible, but usually preserved in ash or salt until they resemble fossils with an attitude. If someone brings out pork belly, check to see if divine intervention has arrived, or maybe a rich cousin is visiting. Tea is served, but not for pleasure. It's boiled, meaning it's safer than water, which is often filled with bacteria and disappointment. You sip it slowly, stomach still wondering when breakfast is supposed to begin. Meals are silent. No chatting. No, "How'd you sleep?" Or, "I had the weirdest dream about the emperor." You sit facing the ancestral shrine, grateful to your great-great-grandparents, even if all they left you was an anemic body and impossible expectations. The bowls are rough. The spoons are wooden. Napkins? Try your sleeve. Once you've swallowed your existential broth, it's time to get moving. And as you rise, your father might nod once. Eat fast. Heaven favors the diligent. Which roughly means, back to work. There are dynasties that won't run themselves. You're dressed and ready, not to impress, but to avoid fines, beatings, or accusations of trying to look above your class. Because in Imperial China, your clothing wasn't an expression of identity. It was a legal declaration. Let's start with fabric. Farmer, you get hemp. Itchy, rough, scratchy hemp. The ancient version of a burlap sack filled with regret. Noble, you wear silk. Elegant, flowing silk that practically whispers, "Raise taxes." But choose wrong, and you're not just making a fashion faux pas. you're committing a crime. Yes, the government actually regulated what you could wear. Sleeve length, hat shape, belt ornaments, even color was controlled. Yellow? That was sacred, reserved for the emperor himself. Why? Because tiny feet, or lotus feet, were considered the height of beauty. A woman's worth was measured by how gracefully she could hobble without collapsing. It wasn't just painful, it was life-altering. Generations of women lived in permanent pain just to be considered beautiful. But at least you got to wear beautiful shoes no one would ever see, since walking was nearly impossible. And men didn't get a break either. Government officials wore layered robes year-round. Yes, even in summer. Because status always came before sweat. Some even wore hats with flaps designed to stop them from whispering in court. So yes, fashion in Imperial China was symbolic, refined, and elegant. It also chafed, suffocated, or shattered bones. Beauty was suffering, and suffering was regulated by law. Now that you're dressed in your socially acceptable sack of misery, it's time to earn your rice. Assuming, of course, the weather and tax collectors are feeling merciful. Let's be honest, in Imperial China, work wasn't a calling. It was an unending obstacle course designed by Confucius and enforced by bureaucrats who had never seen dirt. If you're a farmer, and statistically you are, you spend your life bent over a rice paddy. Not in a poetic way. In a literal, spine-breaking, soul-numbing way. You're up before the sun, knee-deep in mud, slapping mosquitoes the size of dinner rolls, praying the local landlord doesn't raise your grain quota again. Rain? You work. Drought? Work harder. Locusts? Work. And scream. Your tools? A wooden plow if you're lucky. Your bare hands if you're not. Your ox? That's your business partner and retirement plan. Now, if you're a woman, your workday has a part too. You help in the fields and cook, clean, spin thread, raise children, and get blamed if dinner is late or your husband sneezes wrong. Artisans? You spend hours making paper or pottery, sell it for scraps, and hope you can afford stale tofu. Merchants? Technically rich, socially trash. You could own half the town and still be treated like a morally bankrupt raccoon. And then there's corvée labor, mandatory public service. One day the emperor decides he wants a new canal or tomb. Guess who's building it? Barefoot, unpaid, and smiling? Refuse? You're a criminal, possibly a rebel. And when the sun sets, you return home, caked in dirt, to a bowl of congee and the quiet triumph of not dying today. And finally, the Imperial exam system, the golden ticket to social mobility. Or, more accurately, China's eternal torture chamber, made of ink and ideology. If you were born male, had a sliver of ambition, and your family wasn't completely broke, your path was set. Pass the exam. Become a civil servant. Earn respect. Wear silk. Sit in an actual chair. Fail? Back to the rice fields. But this wasn't some multiple choice test. These exams required memorizing the entire Confucian canon, word for word. Then, writing poetic essays so moving, they'd make your ancestors weep and your examiner pass out. Imagine being judged not only on your knowledge, but also on whether your handwriting flowed like a virtuous river. One ink smudge, one crooked stroke, one metaphor that pushed the line a little too far. Instant failure. Studying didn't start in your teens. It began in childhood, and it didn't stop. Not until your spine curved, your fingers locked into brush-holding claws, and your hairline started fleeing the battlefield. Boys were packed into freezing little study huts in winter, or roasted alive in the summer, scrawling out essays until their wrists begged for mercy. Tutors hammered Confucian values into their skulls like academic blacksmiths. Social life? Gone. Hobbies? Confucius. Dreams? Still Confucius. And then came the ultimate nightmare, the Jinshi exam, held in the Imperial capital. You'd be locked inside a booth the size of a coffin. Just you, paper, ink, and the soul-crushing weight of generations' expectations. You brought your own food, bedding, and chamber pot. Yes, really. Some fainted. Others snapped. A few actually died from the pressure. And guess what? No bonus points for effort. Even if you passed the first level, more exams waited. District, provincial, national. Some men studied into their 60s. One poor soul reportedly took the test over 40 times. That's not ambition. That's trauma wrapped in calligraphy. And if you failed, the shame was brutal. Your family, who sacrificed everything to fund your studies, would be heartbroken, loudly. Neighbors would whisper. Your mother might cry. Your father would give you that look. The "why weren't you born smarter" glare. Succeed, and you'd be welcomed into the civil service, where you'd be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by eunuchs. Worth it? That depends on how much you love Confucian essays and chronic anxiety. Feeling dirty yet? Don't worry. You will. Because in Imperial China, hygiene wasn't a lifestyle. It was more like a seasonal suggestion. Bathing? Sure, it happened, occasionally. In summer, maybe a river dip. In winter, forget it. You might go weeks without a proper wash. And soap? Not the lavender-scented spa kind. We're talking animal fat mixed with ash. A gritty blend that felt like scrubbing yourself with regret. Public bathhouses existed in big cities, but privacy wasn't on the menu. You'd be cleaning your armpits next to an old merchant, a crying toddler, and a monk reciting cleanliness proverbs. Refreshing. Toothpaste? Try salt, charcoal, or ground up bones. Toothbrushes were made of animal hair tied to bamboo. Not exactly whitening strips, more like light harassment for your plaque. Dental hygiene was, let's say, basic. Many adults smiled like haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, not pests, roommates. Rich or poor, if you had hair, you had company. Comb shops thrived because lice combs were daily tools. Clothing didn't help. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes meant hauling water, boiling it, and praying the fabric wouldn't fall apart. Underwear? Optional. Especially for peasants. Risky, but efficient. Toilets? Best not to imagine them. Usually just a hole in the ground. Public latrines? like haunted wells, terrifying, smelly, and one sneeze away from disaster. Yes, Imperial China had silk, scrolls, and stunning palaces. But if you wanted a private, hot, relaxing shower, you were born about 1,500 years too early. You've survived lice, mushy porridge, and psychological torture disguised as education. But before you dare complain, remember, in Imperial China, the law is always watching. And unlike modern surveillance, this one comes with bamboo sticks and a strong imagination. The legal codes, especially under the Tang and Qing dynasties, were obsessively detailed. They had rules for everything: how you dressed, how you cried at funerals, how long you could mourn your in-laws. Wear the wrong color on the wrong day? Technically illegal. And yes, everything was written down, on bamboo strips, by scribes who probably hated every second of it. Punishment? Not subtle. Forget courtrooms and punishment? Not subtle. Forget courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice believed in teaching through pain. For small crimes, a bamboo beating. Light insult, small stick. Stole a chicken, bigger stick. Forgot to bow to a magistrate's horse, surprise stick combo. Serious crimes escalated fast. Tattooed faces, exile, public execution. Slowly and theatrically. Torture wasn't a last resort. It was step one. Get accused? You don't plead your case. You get tied to a bench, and they roll out the confession tools. Start with the bamboo rod. Beatings to your back, thighs, or buttocks. Not random. They logged every strike with bureaucratic precision. Still denying guilt? Time for the spiked kneeling board. Sharp wood, rocks, glass. It's like yoga, if yoga wanted to break your soul. Finger crushers? 2 wooden slabs tightened until bones cracked. Adorably named Small Tiger Bench. Cute name. Terrifying sound. And yes, this was standard. Not because it worked. Because it kept the wheels turning. Because truth didn't matter. Order did. Still won't confess? They'd stretch you, lash you, or leave you tied under the sun while they went to lunch. Even if you were innocent, it didn't matter. A confession was required for paperwork. So better to admit to something random than be labeled uncooperative. The takeaway? At least the modern DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you confess to parking incorrectly in 1372. Think you're alone? Think again. In Imperial China, surveillance wasn't digital. It was human. Carefully trained. State-approved, and absolutely everywhere. Start with your village elder, the baozhang, not just a helpful figure. More like your friendly neighborhood informer. Your neighbors? Spies. Cousins? Spies. That illiterate servant? Definitely a spy. The government rewarded people for reporting anything suspicious, and suspicious could mean coughing during a tribute speech, having too much rice, being too quiet. In cities, an intricate web of runners, scribes, and assistants gathered intelligence and reported to higher-ups. Inside the palace, eunuchs, castrated courtiers, controlled spy rings, whispered in emperors' ears, and sometimes ran entire departments. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers simply by knowing everyone's secrets. And freedom of speech? Forget it. Say something like, "The sun looks tired today," and you might get accused of slandering the emperor. Poets learned subtlety. Everyone else learned to stay quiet. Criminal lists were published like terrifying yearbooks. Names, crimes, punishments. It was like Facebook, but with more beheadings. So, if you had a rebellious idea, keep it to yourself. If your cousin did, turn him in. If someone smiled too wide while asking about politics, cough and walk away. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears. So did the trees. And probably your rice bowl. In Imperial China, marriage wasn't about falling in love under cherry blossoms. It was about contracts, obligations, and dowries heavy enough to collapse a mule cart. Love? That was for poems, not real life. Parents arranged marriages, often before you learned how to hold chopsticks. If your family had money, they'd hire a matchmaker, a professional busybody who analyzed birth charts, ancestral records, and whether your future spouse's great-granduncle embarrassed himself 6 dynasties ago. If everything aligned, congrats, you're engaged to a stranger. Physical attraction, personality, shared dreams, irrelevant. Compatibility was calculated by the stars and taxes. For women, marriage wasn't a celebration. It was an elegant abduction. You left your family, took your husband's surname, and moved into his home, where your new full-time job was serving him, his parents, his grandparents, and whatever grumpy uncle was sleeping in the side room. The dowry system meant your family paid to send you off. Land, money, or livestock. The more, the better. In return, the groom's family gave gifts. Sometimes silks, sometimes a slightly cleaner chicken. Once married, your mission was clear. Produce sons. Obey elders. Never, ever raise your voice. Too loud? Too opinionated? Childless? You could be legally replaced by a concubine. And yes, multiple concubines were allowed, especially for wealthy men. In Imperial China, divorce was rare, not because marriages were perfect, but because splitting up was social self-destruction. There were only a handful of acceptable reasons. The 7 outs, things like jealousy, disease, or being a little too chatty over tea. Yes, if your husband decided your small talk was excessive, he could legally send you away. Romantic, isn't it? So no. Marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was more like, try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. Thinking of rebelling? Tired of endless bowing, broken backs, and that smug magistrate who taxed your rice and your patience in the same breath? Brave. But in Imperial China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It made you a footnote. Let's say you rise up, rally your village, burn the tax ledgers, shout slogans about justice. 3 days later, the Imperial Army shows up, with war horses, crossbows, and no sense of humor. You see, emperors were obsessed with stability. Confucian order taught that rebellion didn't just threaten power, it disrupted the cosmic balance. That made you a criminal and a threat to the universe. Your reward? Paraded through town, tortured thoroughly, executed publicly. Some emperors preferred beheading, others liked quartering. One favored slow slicing, a poetic name for being cut into ribbons until your body and file were both complete. And it didn't stop with you. Your entire family, your neighbors, maybe even the guy who once lent you a hoe, all fair game. Collective punishment was the state's favorite sport. And yet, rebellions still happened. The yellow turbans, the white lotus, brave souls rose up again and again. But most were crushed. Survivors were enslaved or recruited for brutal labor projects no one lived long enough to finish. Even talking about rebellion was a gamble. Write a moody poem? Arrested. Suggest the emperor's wall looks a bit crooked? Interrogated. You'd confess, under bamboo sticks and broken fingernails, and be exiled to some frozen rock where even the fleas wanted out. Want to change the system? Best to keep your head down. Literally. Maybe you thought, if I can't survive as a peasant, maybe I'll climb the ranks, pass the exams, live in comfort. Adorable. Welcome to the Imperial Court, where the robes are silk, the tea is hot, and the daggers are ceremonial, until they're not. Inside the Forbidden City, everyone smiled and plotted. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, all locked in a dance of deadly politeness. The only thing sharper than court intrigue was the blade used when it failed. Officials were watched constantly, not just by guards, but by rivals, waiting for the slightest mistake. Mispronounce a character? Hesitate before bowing? Use the wrong metaphor in a poem? Treason. Let's not forget the eunuchs, castrated palace servants with terrifying power. Many began as nobodies, rose like rockets, and became the emperor's gatekeepers. Upset one? Your career vanished. Or you vanished. The imperial harem wasn't a fantasy. It was a pressure cooker of jealousy and ambition. Concubines schemed for favor, poisoned rivals, and hoped to bear the next heir, preferably one who survived infancy. Even the empress struggled to keep control. And when the emperor died, succession meant chaos. Secret wills, mysterious illnesses, backstabbing ministers. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition. So, no, court life wasn't safer. It was just death in silk. You've bowed, bled, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, dodged 3 types of execution. Now, here's the truth. You didn't matter. Not as a person, not to the state. You were a line on a tax ledger, a unit, a body, a grain of rice in the imperial granary. The empire didn't care about your hopes or creativity. It cared about your family's tax record, your son's draft eligibility, your usefulness in a canal project. Your birth was recorded for tax purposes. Your death, mostly to stop your family from collecting your rations. Between those 2 moments, your job was to work, obey, and stay quiet. Follow your passion? No. You followed your father, or your master, or your designated social role. Standing out was dangerous. Uniqueness was treated like a crop disease. Even your emotions had rules. A peasant feeling sad? Fine. Feeling inspired? Don't push it. You didn't own your life, or your labor, or even your body. You could be drafted, relocated, punished, or erased, and replaced. There were always more peasants. You mattered only if you could be counted, taxed, or buried quietly. So here we are, 15 chapters deep into one of the world's greatest civilizations. Imperial China was breathtaking and merciless. Yes, it gave the world gunpowder, paper, the compass, bureaucracy that mostly worked. The Great Wall stretched across mountains. The Forbidden City glittered with imperial might. Poetry flowed like rivers, beautiful, endless, and often fatal if misread. But beneath that elegance, millions of people lived anonymous, back-breaking lives. For every scholar who wrote with delicate ink strokes, 10,000 peasants stood knee-deep in mud, wondering if they'd eat that year. For every emperor buried in jade, hundreds of laborers were buried beside him, to keep secrets buried too. The brilliance of Imperial China came at a cost. Childhoods lost in exam hell, spines broken in rice fields, voices silenced by law. The system worked perfectly for the top 1%. For the rest, it worked them until they collapsed. And the saddest part? Most of them believed it was the natural order, that heaven had chosen their fate, that suffering was a virtue, that silence was wisdom. That's the legacy. Splendor and suffering, locked together like brush and ink. People remember the temples, the poems carved in stone. They forget the concubine who was poisoned, the mother who sold her last hair comb for rice, the scholar who failed his exam for the 7th time and simply vanished. No, you wouldn't last a day in Imperial China, not because you're weak, but because that world wasn't made for survival. It was made for obedience, endurance, and control. And yet, somehow, the people endured. The empire endured. But only a few of their stories were ever told. It wasn't madness. It wasn't savagery. It was math. A cold calculation. Starve or survive. 19-year-old Sarah Graves later admitted what the first bite was like, then never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and glass-eyed, kept his silence. Mary Ann Graves held her sister's hand and whispered, "Whatever it takes, we get home." When they finally emerged from the mountains, weeks later, only 7 remained. 5 women and 2 men. Their cheeks were sunken. Their lips were split. They didn't speak, but what they carried was heavier than food or maps. They brought news. Dozens were still alive, trapped, starving, frozen, waiting. Suddenly, California, which had quietly ignored the Donner situation, couldn't anymore. The shame, the horror, was too great. Rescue parties were formed, but by then it was February. The snow was deeper. The cabins at Donner Lake were now white tombs. When the first rescuers reached the site, they didn't find a camp. They found a graveyard. Cabins were half buried, doors frozen shut. Inside, figures sat motionless, too weak to move, eyes hollow. Children clinging to corpses, bodies stacked like firewood. The smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, told them what had happened. The survivors tried to speak, most just stared. Of the 87 who set out, nearly half were dead. Those still alive were skeletal, silent, and drifting somewhere beyond human. Rescuers brought flour, blankets, meat, but not enough. The snowdrifts were too high. They had to choose. They took the children first, the smallest, the lightest, the ones most likely to survive. Parents watched as strangers carried their babies into the snow, not knowing if they'd ever see them again. 3 more rescue parties followed over the next 2 months, each fighting through blizzards and bone-deep cold, each finding fewer survivors and darker truths. Cannibalism. Not just survival, but choice. Whispers said some had waited too long. Others helped death along. The names were kept quiet. The rumors were louder. James Reed, once exiled from the party for killing in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children, alive. George Donner lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him, again and again. Eventually, she stayed behind. She never made it out. Some said she died of cold. Others whispered something worse, that she had trusted the wrong men and been eaten by them. The government stayed silent. California was on the verge of U.S. statehood and didn't want its dream of manifest destiny tarnished by starving cannibals in the snow. There was no inquiry, no investigation, just silence. But in saloons and parlors, everyone talked. The Donners became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children, never take shortcuts. The nation couldn't look away. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, inevitable. Now it was bloody, burned, and haunted. Newspapers feasted on the details. Who ate whom? Who died slowly? Who waited too long to die? Sarah Graves became a media obsession. So did Mary Murphy, who lost her entire family. They were praised as survivors and judged as monsters. James Reed, once disgraced, was now hailed as a hero. He spent his life trying to protect the names of those who'd made it out. But the whispers never stopped. Tamsin Donner became a tragic icon, a devoted wife who died in silence. The trauma didn't vanish when the snow melted. Children returned home, wide-eyed and hollow. Many grew up, married, and lived quiet lives. But the pain pulsed like a hidden wound. Virginia Reed, just 13 at the time, lived a long life and even published her story. But her smile never reached her eyes. Mary Murphy, after losing everything, married young and died young. Louis Keseberg, a German immigrant rescued last, was branded by rumors that he'd done more than eat the dead, that he'd killed them. He sued for libel and won $1. The stain never left him. Some survivors changed their names. Others never stopped talking. None were ever the same. It wasn't just the cannibalism. It was the slow breakdown of humanity, watching friends turn to bones, hearing mothers weep silently, choosing who would live and who would wait for rescue. Some communities honored them, others gossiped. They had become living shadows of a dream turned nightmare. James Reed rebuilt his life, fought in the war, prospered. But even in old age, he wrote letters filled with ghosts. No one who survived the Donner Party came back unchanged. Whether 8 or 80, they had stared into the abyss and walked out with blood on their hands and frost in their lungs. And in doing so, they left behind a brutal truth. Survival isn't always heroic. It's not always noble. Sometimes it's just enduring what you became. The Sierra Nevada never forgot. The lake where they waited, starved, and fed is now called Donner Lake, a picture-perfect postcard with a name that murmurs unease. In 1918, a granite monument was built. At the top, a solemn family. Father, mother, child, all gazing westward. At the base, 22 feet tall, the height of the snow that winter. It stands not just for the Donners, but for the line between civilization and savagery. A line buried under ice, desperation, and choices no one should ever have to make. Even carved in stone, the Donner Monument can't bear to speak the truth. There's no mention of what was eaten. No inscription of the quiet betrayals. No names for the consumed. It's a monument meant for public comfort, not historical honesty. Each year, school children visit Donner Lake. They hear the PG version. Pioneers got trapped, some starved, a few survived, rarely more. It's easier to honor grit than to look into the eyes of what survival cost. But the mountains remember. The trails they walked now lie beneath ski resorts and hiking paths. The site where Tamzine Donner chose to stay with her dying husband, now a picnic area. The cabin where starving children sat in silence, marked by a cheerful interpretive plaque. And yet, the air still feels heavy, as if the earth remembers the boots crunching over snow, the mothers rocking dead infants, the shivering hands sharing meat in silence. Nature doesn't apologize. But the story remains, not just because it horrifies us, but because it reminds us what it means to be human. The Donner Party was never just about failure or cannibalism. It was about the impossible things people will do to protect each other, to cling to hope, to choose life, even in its most terrible form. In the years that followed, the story twisted. Details faded. Gossip grew. America, always hungry for drama, shaped the Donners into a legend. Dark, distorted, and useful. Some were cast as tragic heroes. Others, like Louis Kayseberg, became scapegoats. Rumors said he hoarded food, killed Tamzine, enjoyed it. None of it was proven. But truth wasn't the point. The public wanted martyrs and monsters. Survivors were dragged into the spotlight. Every interview reopened wounds. Every news sketch relit the trauma. Some, like Virginia Reed, tried to speak plainly, warning future travelers. Don't take shortcuts, trust experience. Others said nothing, too tired to correct a world that saw them as monsters in buckskin. By the late 1800s, the Donner story was folklore. Campfire stories, classroom warnings, a metaphor for arrogance, hubris, and trusting the wrong guide. The Hastings cutoff became infamous, a shortcut to death. The real tragedy? It was preventable. It wasn't snow that killed them. It was bad leadership, blind optimism, and the systemic naivety of manifest destiny. There's something painfully American about it all. The belief in reinvention, the fantasy of taming nature, the promise of paradise just over the next ridge. But the Donner story cracks that myth wide open. No heroes, no villains, just people. Cold, starving, and making choices they never imagined. And that question still lingers. What would you have done? Today, the Donners are more than a footnote. They're a symbol, debated, twisted, unforgettable. Their story doesn't fit cleanly into the museum of westward triumph. It sits off to the side, stained and splintered. Yes, we remember the cannibalism. But that was just the final act. The real story lies in the faith in the wrong map, the silence in the cabins, the screams swallowed by the snow. They remind us that survival isn't always clean. It's not noble. Sometimes It's just enduring what you had to become. And still, the lake remains. Still, people visit. Still, they walk through snowmelt and pine needles, reading signs about hunger and courage. Because the Donners never left. Their story refuses to die. And in the biting wind of the Sierra Nevada, you can still hear it whisper, "What would you have done?" She wasn't born a princess. She was born something far more dangerous. Ambition in silk. The year was 624 CE. The Tang dynasty was still young, poetic, and full of promise. Her father, a wealthy timber merchant, believed his daughters deserved books, tutors, and a voice. From the start, Wu Jiao was different. While other girls practiced pouring tea, Wu was reading military theory and imagining herself not beside the throne. At just 14, her wit and beauty caught the eye of Emperor Taizong. She was brought to court, one concubine among dozens. But Wu had no plans to fade into the curtains. She studied the palace, when to speak, when to disappear, when to strike. When Taizong died, she should have vanished into a convent, her fate sealed by tradition. But Wu had already captured the heart of his son, the future Emperor Gaozong. Within a year, she returned, not as a forgotten widow, but as a rising star. What followed wasn't seduction, it was strategy. She bore Gaozong's sons, she whispered policies into his ear, and one day, her infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances. Wu blamed Empress Wang. The result? Wang was deposed, imprisoned, mutilated. Wu Jiao was now empress, not through charm, but through chess. As Gaozong's health declined, Wu stepped forward. She spoke on his behalf, reviewed his reports, sat in on court meetings. Behind the screen, she ruled. And when Gaozong died, she didn't retreat. She replaced their son when he got too independent, installed another, more obedient. And then she asked a question history had never heard in China. Why rule through a man at all? In 690 CE, Wu Jiao did the unthinkable. She declared herself emperor. A new dynasty, the Zhou, was born. Confucian scholars were horrified, but she had already rewritten the rules. She used Buddhism to legitimize her reign. She had portraits carved in stone, temples built in her name. She ruled with merit, not family name. She promoted farmers, reformed the bureaucracy. For 15 years, Wu Jiao was not just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person in the world's largest empire. Despite the passage of time, Wu Zetian's legacy remains deeply complicated. Confucian historians of later eras vilified her, painting her as a ruthless temptress who manipulated her way to the throne and drenched her court in blood. Tales of her cruelty were inflated, her lovers multiplied, and her ambition portrayed as near satanic. It was easier for historians to demonize her than to accept the uncomfortable truth. She outshone many of the male rulers who came before her. Today, a more balanced perspective has emerged. Modern historians now recognize Wu Zetian not only as a formidable woman, but as one of the most capable rulers in Chinese history, regardless of gender. Her reign was intricate and full of contradiction, yet it remains a powerful study in political skill, resilience, and ideological mastery. She ruled in an era that told her to remain silent. Instead, she broke the silence and the system designed to suppress her. Even after efforts to erase her, her legacy still resonates, fierce and unforgettable. To truly grasp Wu Zetian's rule is to understand how she reshaped China, not just through laws and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. She redefined what it meant to be imperial. Where traditional emperors relied on Confucian scholars and military leaders, Wu built a court rooted in Buddhist philosophy, loyal civil servants, and scholars who rose through merit, not noble birth. Her reforms to the civil service exam opened doors to those from lower social classes, breaking the aristocratic hold that had dominated since the Han Dynasty. This led to a more dynamic and educated bureaucracy, the effects of which would outlive her. Artistically, she ushered in a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and grand statues were built in her name. One of the most notable is the massive Vairocana Buddha at Longmen Grottoes, serene, commanding, and bearing features that strongly resemble Wu herself. These weren't just religious expressions. They were political declarations that a woman could embody divine order. Wu even transformed language. She introduced dozens of new Chinese characters, many designed to glorify her reign. While most disappeared after her death, the very act of altering written language to suit her rule reveals the scale of her ambition. Perhaps her boldest move was how she reimagined gender. By presenting herself as both nurturing mother and unshakable sovereign, she absorbed masculine authority rather than challenging it outright. She became both emperor and empress, dragon and phoenix. Her regime wasn't perfect. Dissent was punished harshly. Trust was rare, and justice often served her interests. But under her leadership, the empire didn't just survive, it evolved. She didn't merely govern the Tang dynasty, she transformed it. Wu Zetian died more than 1,300 years ago, yet her reign still echoes across China's cultural memory. Once erased from history, her legacy now flickers between myth and memory. In folklore, she has been cast as everything from a sinister seductress to a divine queen. Opera troupes depicted her as tragic or tyrannical, but never forgettable. No other woman in Chinese history has scaled the heights she did. Others ruled as regents or dowagers, but none declared themselves emperor. None created a new dynasty. None rewrote language or stood alone atop the imperial throne. And this remains her most defiant legacy, that she shattered the ultimate ceiling and bore the cost. To some, she's a warning about unchecked ambition. To others, she's a symbol of brilliance and resilience. She wasn't a saint, nor did she want to be. Wu ruled to endure, not to be adored. In doing so, she made history. She was the woman who rose from the shadows of the palace, who stepped into a world that said no and answered with a throne. In the land of dragons, she crowned herself the phoenix, and in that fire, her name was forged forever. In the ancient world, a road wasn't merely a route, it was a proclamation of power. When rulers ordered roads carved through forest, mountain, or desert, they weren't just easing travel, they were extending their grip. Roads were empires in motion, a human response to nature's chaos. Unlike rivers or seas, which followed natural patterns, roads were deliberate. They connected capitals with distant provinces and reminded all, rebel or merchant, that civilization had a long reach. The earliest roads date back to Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, simple dirt tracks used for trade. Even then it was clear: control the path, control the flow of goods, people, and influence. The Persian Empire's royal roads stretched over 1,500 miles, equipped with rest stations and relay couriers. Herodotus noted that messages could travel its full length in just 7 days, a speed that demonstrated imperial might. But it was Rome that turned road building into a science and a strategy. Over 50,000 miles of paved roads stitched together a vast empire. Roman roads, straight and layered like a stone cake, were built for endurance. They moved armies, grain, and ideas with unmatched speed. Cities thrived along these roads. Trade boomed, and culture, Roman law, language, architecture, flowed along their length like blood through arteries. For the Incas, roads were miracles of mountain engineering. Spanning over 25,000 miles across rugged Andean terrain, the Kapaknan united their empire, from coastal deserts to snow-capped peaks. Built without wheels or metal tools, the system relied on llamas and relay runners who transported messages, fish, and even ice at astonishing speeds. Rope bridges spanned deadly gorges, rebuilt annually in communal rituals still honored today. In Persia, the Royal Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a statement. Initiated by Darius the Great, it connected far-flung parts of the empire with stations, rest stops, and even toll collection. It allowed for military mobilization, tax collection, and fast communication. Alexander the Great later marched his army along its stones. The road outlived the empire that built it. Meanwhile, Han Dynasty China built roads that would help shape the legendary Silk Road. Though less uniformly paved than Roman ones, Han roads extended China's influence westward. With relay stations and military garrisons, they ensured swift communication and opened doors to diplomacy, trade, and the spread of ideas like Confucianism and Buddhism. These roads weren't just for merchants, they were tools of unification. The Greeks, though not famed for expansive highways, built routes that tied city-states together and carried philosophy, religion, and ideas. Sacred roads to places like Delphi or Eleusis weren't just paths, they were spiritual experiences, journeys of transformation. In India, Emperor Ashoka's roads bore pillars inscribed with messages of peace and tolerance. Roads were shaded with trees, lined with wells, and filled with rest stops. They weren't just ways to travel, they were channels for moral governance, linking trade, faith, and statecraft. Across the world, ancient roads conquered more than distance. They bridged gaps in terrain, culture, and ideology. With bridges, drainage, and layered stone, roads defied nature's obstacles. Where armies marched, cities rose. Where messages flew, empires held. Today, their remnants lie under highways or weathered in remote hillsides. But their influence endures. Roads, ancient and modern, remain the silent architects of civilization. The arteries through which power, belief, and connection still flow.